Hi, this is Nils Andreasen. I'm the Executive Director of the Alaska Municipal League, and wanted to provide our members and Alaskans, Alaska policymakers, some sense of our understanding of the American Rescue Plan and its implications for Alaska. And it's important to know that all of this is preliminary. It's subject to a lot of change in the weeks to come, but it does give us some sense of the direction that we'll need to anticipate going. So first, I guess it's important to know that, again, there's a lot to come, but this is a significant act that will impact Alaska in many different ways and very positively, we hope, across the board. I'm going to run through a number of the provisions in the Act and hope that this gives you some better sense of everything that's in there without going too deep into everything that's in there. So first, everybody's probably familiar with the fact that there's direct payments to Alaskans, $1,400 per person. This is based on some reduced eligibility, so it's not going to go to everybody, to high earners. But Alaskans should benefit, and especially those who have experienced, pretty significant shock over the last year due to the economic crisis. These payments are already out the door for many, and hopefully making a difference. There's a number of tax credit provisions that are worth knowing about as you begin planning this coming year. There's an increase to an extension of the earned income, the dependent care, and the child tax credit. So those are things to pay attention to. There's an employee retention credit and paid leave credit that might be important for employers and especially businesses. And then for those of you familiar with I think it's the Families Facing Coronavirus Relief Act, something like that, Families First, passed last year. It was one of the first federal relief bills. It required employers to provide leave to all employees if they were sick, if they needed to quarantine, etc. This impacted many local governments, but while businesses received a tax credit from that, a reimbursable tax credit, state and local governments did not. So the American Rescue Act has a provision in there to try to address that, and it remains to be seen how that will be utilized. There's an extension to additional unemployment benefits on the federal side, so the state will work through what this means for its distribution of unemployment benefits. I think excitingly, from the SBA, Small Business Administration, there is a limited payroll protection program funding increase. That closes in just a week and a half or so, March 31st. It's probable that there would be an extension to that, but something to be paying attention to for businesses who are still waiting for federal relief. That's been increased. It's also been expanded to include nonprofits. And then separately, there's a EIDL increase, which for businesses, many have already accessed. There are two additional funding opportunities for businesses. There's a restaurant revitalization fund with grants available that are equal to the pandemic-related revenue loss for restaurants. And there's funding for shuttered venue operators. And I think I would watch small business development folks, SBA, anybody kind of working on business initiatives. Your ARDers should be well aware of these opportunities and how to access those. So all that's still under development, I think, but you'll probably see guidance in the coming weeks. The bill also extends SNAP and WIC with increases for those programs. For health and human services, there's a lot to that. Some of it will be seen directly, some of it pretty indirectly, but there is supplemental vaccination and testing grants for state and local distribution. We think that's similar to some other funding that the states receive through DHSS. There's currently a process in place to establish memorandums of agreement with local governments to either utilize those funds for vaccination or testing, or to pass those through to healthcare providers or nonprofits. And so we're looking forward to more information about what that will look like. There's funding available for state and local government public health departments, for those that have public health departments and a support workforce. There's funding available for community health centers. I think there's just a few of those in the state. And we're not sure for a lot of these things that I would, for across the board. Some of these are formula driven. So there's a standard formula that will just flow automatically from the federal to the state or to another entity. Some of these are block grants. They'll flow just to the state and then follow the current program. Some of these are competitive grants. And so there's a wide array of how the state and local governments and businesses and others will be accessing these federal programs, this federal relief. And hopefully we have more details on that in the coming weeks. Our block grants for substance abuse, mental health services, the child care and development block grants, these go to the state and then to providers. I think that goes out through DHSS. There are child care stabilization grants with a child care entitlement to states. That sounds formula driven, but it'll be up to the state to determine how that gets applied. And there is emergency funding to states for low-income families and with children. And again, I would expect DHSS to follow up with more information about how these are applied. A number of other funding programs out there: mental health services block grants, substance abuse, grants for community behavioral health clinics, funds for Head Start, home visiting programs, child abuse prevention and treatment grants, and family violence grants. So all of those things are ones to watch for as opportunities open up. There's Older American Act funding, including for nutrition programs, and then through HHS at the federal level. I think LIHEAP will open up for the state to add to its allocation for LIHEAP. That's energy assistance. Plus separately, there's water and sewer assistance funding to be watching for. There are Medicaid and Medicare provisions that will apply at the state level, and ACA provisions that employers will have to pay attention to. And there is a 100% COBRA subsidy that, as we learn more about, we'll share with local government employers. Three other big buckets: emergency management, transportation, and education. The federal government will maintain its 100% FEMA reimbursement to states and local governments. That's important because for Alaska, the states picked up that match traditionally. That match has traditionally been 25%. So I think what's important is that over the course of the last year and into this coming year, the federal government will pick up 100% of those FEMA eligible reimbursable costs and pay that back to state and local governments who apply. It's a challenging process, but I think if we work together, we could actually see a lot of the direct costs related to COVID mitigation or response picked up at the federal level. FEMA has some firefighter grants, SAFER, which is another type of firefighter grants, and emergency management performance grants. I think those are competitive, and I hope we can all work together. And by we all, I mean local governments on the one hand, and also with the state, to see if Alaska can benefit from some of that FEMA funding. For seafood processors, there's food supply chain funding through USDA. Maybe Alaska's fishing industry can benefit from that. There's operating assistance formula grants to states to support rural transit programs and agencies. There's a number of local governments with what are considered rural transit programs, so they should see some portion of that funding. And then separately, there's airport funding for costs related to operations and COVID response. And most likely, both of those go through DOT at the state level. Similarly, for education, DEED is working through the Department of Education. The state level is working through the school district funding that's available through this American Rescue Plan. That funding is specific for things like ventilation system improvements, support staff, reducing class sizes, PPE, learning loss remediation. And so districts are already working to figure out how to utilize that on top of some of the other funding they've had to supplement all the shift that's occurred over the last year in the delivery of education. These public school districts do have to have a plan to return to in-person operations, I think within the first month or within 30 days to be able to utilize these funds. Separately for education, there's funds to IDEA, there's funds for non-public schools allocated out through the governor. There's school and library internet funding through the FCC E-rate program. And I remember, I think there's internet funding in the current budget being proposed, and this might be able to supplement something like that. One of the important caveats, I think, for educations is that states have to maintain their spending on K-12 and higher education this year and next year, at least at proportional relatives to kind of the state's overall spending. And that's relative to FY 18, 19, and 20. So they're going to look at past years and make sure that education is not treated disproportionately to other spending adjustments made in this and the next fiscal cycle. Finally, for utilities, consumers, housing, I guess I'll add that the university will have some funding available for lost revenue. There are a number of restrictions on its use, including that must be used a significant portion on financial aid. Many of you are familiar with the emergency rent relief and utility assistance programs that Anchorage and AHFC have had access to funding through the, I think the last relief act passed in December. So I think passed in December was $200 million or something that came to Alaska. This is an additional amount. And then on top of that, there's extra for rural housing. To address homelessness, there's emergency housing vouchers. And there's also increased funding for the homeowner assistance fund. So that would include things like mortgage payments, property taxes, utilities, insurance. I know that I don't think that was in the last relief package, so that will be something to pay attention to in terms of how that might get distributed and become available for homeowners who weren't addressed in the emergency rent relief program this last round. For these housing funds, not more than 15% of those funds can be used for admin by the state or local governments. There's low-income household drinking water, wastewater emergency assistance program to help with payments for drinking water and wastewater expenses. I know that's been a big issue for many Alaska communities. The VA has, I've only included just the one here, but has a number of funding programs. This one is specific to construction funds to upgrade homes and support for state-operated facilities. There is emergency assistance through TANF. And then the EDA has some economic assistance, competitive grants for planning and projects, with 25% reserved for states and local governments who have seen kind of disproportionate losses related to travel, tourism, or outdoor recreation centers. And we know that many Alaska communities are on top of the list for their lost revenue this last year due to travel, tourism challenges. So we're hopeful that Alaska communities, both our boroughs and our cities, will have some increased access to this economic assistance through EDA. Finally, for the corporation for public broadcasting, there are stabilization grants to small and rural stations. And we know that we've seen those budgets reduced over the last few years. And so we're really hopeful that that can support our public radio, public TV here in Alaska, which I know so many Alaska communities depend on. Switching gears to kind of what this means, directly for the state and local governments. There is a provision here. This is, some would say, unprecedented, but there's $350 billion in the bill available for directly to states, to cities, and to counties. And I think what's unprecedented is that this is direct aid to cities and counties in a way that's really never occurred before. With the CARES Act, funding went to some cities, but mostly went to the state to then figure out how to allocate. And that process was conducted really differently across the nation. Alaska stood out and did really well in kind of following Treasury guidance for its CARES Act distribution to local governments, allocating 45%, which was the recommended amount, out to cities and boroughs, and wrapping up its distribution, really right over these few months. I think we're at 93% of that having been expended by now. So this comes at an appropriate time. The CARES Act funds have run out for the majority of communities. They're still spending on a lot of COVID mitigation, COVID response, economic recovery funding, and looking at this next year's budget and trying to figure out how to make ends meet. So this state and local relief is going to be really important. These are high-level numbers. 195 billion for states. There's a base level of 500 million, but there's some caveats to that bring up, between the state's allocations and local governments, that I think the baseline needs to be 1.25 billion as a combination. There's 130 billion for local governments, for cities and counties. In Alaska, that would be boroughs. And there's 20 billion for federally recognized tribal governments. Separately, there's a carve out of 10 billion for capital project funding that will just go to states. And you can see here that's for capital projects related to that enable work, education, and health monitoring, including remote operations in response to the public health emergency. There's some additional caveats for that. And a lot of it, I think, falls back to water, sewer investments, as well as broadband. Finally, this was a new addition, a 1.5 billion that will be provided to eligible revenue share counties. So these are counties that have public lands within them that normally get a payment in lieu of taxes and/or secure rural schools funding from the federal government. So between this and this coming year, there will be a formula that's developed based on a variety of factors that'll be available to those counties. And we don't know what that looks like yet, but it should actually help a lot of our boroughs who are mostly very small population. They have small population, so they get penalized on the allocation kind of for the direct payments, but maybe this will supplement some of what they're seeing. We don't know a lot right now in terms of what this all looks like. We do know that we're waiting for Treasury to provide guidance. And for those states, local governments who have went through the CARES Act process, the Treasury guidance is a fascinating process because it comes out and it gets revised the next week, and then 2 weeks later there's an FAQ, and then that gets updated three weeks after that. And it's a continuous barrage of trying to figure out from Treasury what the right clear guidance is for utilization of this direct funding. I imagine that we've learned from that experience that the guidance that Treasury comes out with in relation to this builds off that CARES Act experience and includes a lot of the same provisions, even though there's an expanded list of eligible expenses. And these 4 bullets kind of point to how local and state and tribal governments can use these funds. So they can be used for the public health emergency. They can be used to address its economic impacts. They can be used to provide premium pay for essential employees or to employers for their essential employees. Most importantly, and I think maybe not most importantly, but the significant difference from this and the CARES Act is this allows for lost revenue replacement. That for that funding that didn't come in over the last year, this allows states and local governments to supplement their budgets with that difference to make sure that those government services continue. Finally, and really clear in here is that funding is allowed to for states and local and tribal governments to make investments in water and sewer and broadband infrastructure. There are caveats in terms of what it can't be used for, and most importantly, it can't be used to fund pension systems. So something like the additional state contribution or paying down the net pension liability on the state side, these funds couldn't be used for that. It's also the other provision or preemption is that states can't use this allocation to enact a tax cut. So they can't reduce their taxes through these funds. These funds can be transferred to anybody else, to other local. So if a local government gets these funds or a tribal government gets these funds, they can trade them back and forth. Whoever's got more capacity to manage them, wherever there's need, these funds can flow between communities, to nonprofits, to public benefit corporations, and to others to make sure they get to where they need to be. There will still be things to work through in terms of compliance and reporting. In terms of the process, we think this is how it goes. So we understand that Treasury has to distribute the funds to state and local governments within 60 days of enactment. So we're kind of a week in to that process. That at least for local governments, we believe those funds come out in 2 tranches, which means that half of the funds come out within those 60 days and then the other half a year later. So really this is a multi-year process where these funds are coming to local governments. Boroughs will receive their allocation directly. Anchorage, which is a CDBG entitlement city, it's the only one in Alaska that's a federal designation, will receive theirs directly as a city. And then all others, we think, will go through the state. So all the non-entitlement cities, non-CDBG entitlement cities would go through the state. And then on the borough list are census areas too, and the cities within census areas, cities within the unorganized borough, their allocation would flow out through the state too, we think. And that's, that was the state's role with the CARES Act funding. It was managed through OMB and Department of Commerce through DCRA. So we're looking, to them to work with us and work with communities to figure out what this process looks like. If Treasury has 60 days to deliver those funds to direct recipients and the state, then the state has 30 days to distribute those funds out to that list of cities. So basically all cities in Alaska would look to the state for their distribution 30 days after the state's received its. The state can request a waiver, but there's a penalty otherwise. 30 days is kind of the amount of time that the legislature will have to work with appropriating those funds if it determines that's what's needed to get those to Alaska's cities. We're still working out some of this, but it may be that direct recipients need to be enrolled in a federal grants program, a grant solution, or something like that, grants.gov. We're learning more about that process. A couple notes on the state aid. Treasury is able to withhold up to half of the state's allocation if it wants to determine some level of need. I don't imagine that happening in Alaska. And just a note that when it comes to the infrastructure projects, if 2024 is the end of the covered period when these funds need to be spent by, then probably the infrastructure we're talking about is really focused on kind of shovel-ready projects related to water, sewer, and broadband, things that we can move quickly on to have that wrapped up in a few years or expended in a couple of years. Here's directly from the bill more detail on allowable uses, and there's no one priority over another in this. There's a lot of I guess, flexibility within this. Treasury will take these 4 bullet points and expand them into here are all the potential uses, but even that will just be kind of a short list and still up to state and local governments to figure out what they want to do with it based on this fairly broad guidance. And again, anything related to the public health emergency, very similar to the CARES Act, any COVID mitigation response, public health, dealing with economic impacts. So that means assistance out to businesses, nonprofits, individuals, anybody who needs that kind of support beyond what the federal relief is providing. That would allow communities to fine tune some of their responses to economic relief. But none of these are requirements either. So it's just as likely that they could hopefully pay their, they could consider paying their essential workforce out of this. There was a provision in CARES Act for all your public safety employees to be covered with CARES Act funding. The fact that there's hazard pay allowed within this, I think, is correcting for some of the vagary in the CARES Act. C is going to be kind of the most squishy in terms of the guidance that needs to come out. It really needs to be clear about how do you measure what was lost revenue and how do you determine what that can be applied to. But to some extent, some local governments will hopefully make their budgets whole after what's been a very challenging period. And that's going to be really important as they're facing this upcoming budget cycle, and will continue to need to meet the needs of residents and businesses into the years to come. And we don't want to go into an economic recovery period where your local government doesn't have the tools it needs to continue assisting and kind of stabilizing what's necessary at the community level. Finally, the fourth eligible use, again, is for water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. And just on that note, I think it's worth thinking through how do we collaborate on water, sewer, broadband infrastructure development in the state of Alaska when we have the state, we've got federal attention on it, we've got local governments and tribes, each with funding available for those specific purposes. What's the level of collaboration that's going to be necessary to really move a project forward? And what are the partnerships that we need to have in place to do so? Couple other notes. Cities can't receive more than 75% of the city's most recent budget. Nobody does based on current allocations. Can't be used for pension funds. We talked about that. We think the covered period is through end of 2024. So these funds remain available until then. And all of these funds will require reporting back to Treasury at the federal level, either directly or through the state. We're not quite sure, but periodic reports are required. There's still questions that we have, and I know that the National League of Cities, National Association of Counties, Government Finance Officers Association, National Conference of State Legislatures, everybody's working on what are the questions, how do we get Treasury to answer these as part of its guidance, how do we have as much clarity as possible as we move forward, so that we can move quickly in response to the needs that our communities and residents and businesses have. So we hope that when Treasury comes out with guidance that it's really clear about what are allowable expenditures based on those 4 guiding principles. What are the covered periods for each of the different pots of funding that are available? How do you certify lost revenue? And how do you certify, prove out what are eligible uses? What are the reporting requirements and who are they to and how frequent? What kind of tracking is necessary? We know that a federal single audit would be necessary for any local government or others receiving more than $750,000 in federal funds. And that's not most of the cities who will be. It's not most local governments in Alaska who trigger that, but for those that it does, they'll need to think through what are those future federal single audits going to cost and how do we arrange them. I think one question for both Treasury and the state is to figure out whether unincorporated communities within the unorganized borough would also be eligible, since they wouldn't be considered a city, I don't think, within federal law. So we'll have to work through that. Is public safety a provision or an eligible expense as part of the first category of expenditures? Is prohibited tax relief only at the state level? Does it apply to local governments? We don't think it does, but we want to be really clear about what that means. For pensions, we can't pay into a pension system, but can we pay employee pensions as part of your regular payroll? We think so, but again, you just want to be clear on all of this before moving forward. For the funds that are coming in, can they be put into interest-bearing accounts? With CARES Act, they could be, but the interest needed to be applied still to eligible uses. So we would expect something like the same thing for this American Rescue Plan. And finally, could these funds be applied to debt service on infrastructure if that was if your lost revenue was tied to that expenditure? Could these funds go to that debt service? So these are some of the questions that are out there. I'm sure there are dozens, hundreds more. And this is just for the state and local relief. So for everything, there's dozens of questions still to wrestle with. What's coming to Alaska? These are all preliminary numbers provided from the White House, from Congress, from Congressional Budget Office. It remains to be seen exactly how this all works, but this is the short list of things we know about, we think, right now. So just over $1 billion will go to the state of Alaska. That's not unrestricted, but the 4 bullets that apply to state and local relief are exactly for that portion. So that's, for that $1 billion, it's public health, economic impacts, hazard pay, lost revenue, and associated government services, and then investments in water, sewer, and broadband. Separately, there's $112 million going to the state of Alaska specific to infrastructure. And I think, again, it's that water, sewer, broadband that applies to. Out of the local allocation, so you have to think about it in terms of a couple different buckets. So there's your CDBG eligible community. So Anchorage receives a direct allocation, and then all the other cities receive a separate allocation, presumably through DCRA and OMB in the state. So those are that's your city allocation, just over, right around $88 million. And then for your boroughs, that includes census areas, there's $141 million going. That they'll get those directly, except for the census area allocation, which is just around 15 million, we think, to go to cities within the unorganized borough. Again, Department of Commerce or DCRA, OMB will need to determine how those get outlaid. So in addition to that relief, there's $360 million that will go to school districts. I know Department of Education here in Alaska is already working through what that looks like and communicating out to schools. And there's very specific uses of that funding. But $360 million coming to Alaska for tribes in Alaska, more than that, $400 million to tribes. I've only seen this secondhand, but that might mean something like 1.7 million to each tribe in Alaska, which is really significant. And after the effort that we've gone through in addressing this public health crisis, a lot thanks to our tribal governments and to tribal healthcare system, that'll be just a really significant opportunity for us all to be working together on common purposes. So separately, some of the department funding that might become available, this emergency rental assistance that the last round went out through AHFC. Anchorage as a CDBG entitled eligible community, I think also has access to that, or maybe just as part of its designation. So we'll see that funding flow to both AHFC and Anchorage, and I know both have been collaborating together, and AHFC also collaborating with many local governments to do outreach on emergency rental assistance. 43 million, I think, additional to LIHEAP. So that will need to be a program, further developed there. You've got your child care development block grants and your child care stabilization grants, 74 million, again, going out through DHSS. I think there's some transit funds, 11 million to Anchorage, 3.7 million to Fairbanks, that should go directly, or they'll go through DOT and then allocate it out. And then DOT's portion, we know for rural transit is 2.74 million. That might be a good opportunity to, one, make sure that, rural transit programs at the local level are funded appropriately, but maybe that's something like AMHS that could be addressed through that, or the ferry system. And we do have suggestions for how the state could use this. We know that the state's experiencing a revenue shortfall, going now on its 6th, 7th year. So we hope that a large portion of this American Rescue Plan can be used to stabilize this year's budget, to look at FY21 needs and FY22 budgets, and whether some of the American Rescue Plan can be used to supplement those budgets as the fund source change, to look at lost revenue over the last year and into this current, and see if we can replace some of that, with these funds. So first, kind of staunch the gap, fill the gap when it comes to current state spending. Then make sure, for the things that are currently proposed not to be funded but should be at statutory levels, let's make sure that those are funded appropriately. Essentially make sure that state government and its partners at the local level have what they need, stabilize governance to support Alaska's economic recovery. And then think about the rest in terms of what capital needs could we use this for, both for deferred maintenance, which is, you got a pretty an increasing backlog, and then for your municipal school water and sewer needs, your broadband needs. And there are some good programs out there that could be invested into. We hope that state funding could be applied to AMHS operations. Make sure that the ferry system has what it needs. If there's not a cruise ship season, is there investment into the ferry system that could really support a summer tourist season with smaller numbers, but still a busy schedule? Could state funding go to you, to put funding out as community assistance, and then make sure that community assistance is recapitalized for future years through what otherwise would have gone out? Let's make sure we're working with each other to address some of these issues that are out there, the broadband, school, or water, sewer issues, other priorities. Let's work together between the state, local governments, schools, and tribes to do joint projects, joint planning, and jointly addressing many of the concerns or priorities that we share. Let's make sure we invest in local emergency planning committees. Funding for those have been cut over the last couple of years. Let's look at our village police officers and make sure that we're investing in that level of Alaska's public safety. VPOs don't currently get any state funding, but they've had just as many responsibilities as other law enforcement in the state with very few resources. And these funds might be able to, over the next couple of years, supplement what they're doing, make sure they've got all the necessary PPE, bulletproof vests, whatever makes them safe and increases Alaska's public safety, might be worth, well, we would argue is worth investing in. Finally, let's think about what targeted aid could go out, to municipalities who the American Rescue Plan doesn't make up the difference for what they've lost, to businesses for same thing, and to individuals, again, where aid has been insufficient so far. Let's target those who have experienced this pandemic and the economic crisis so directly. Local governments will do their part, and the reality is that the federal aid that's coming for most is very little, especially given the fact that it's spread out over 2 years. and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But this is pretty minimal funding. It's not a windfall. It does stabilize some budgets that are in need of it. And I think the most we can hope for the majority of communities is that it makes their budgets whole, kind of to pre-pandemic levels, so they can continue to deliver pre-pandemic levels of services, and at this point, expanded services as needed. Hopefully, these funds can be used to replace lost revenues, and again, to stabilize government services. Can they clean up any outstanding debts that they have by thinking through the fund source changes that they can utilize to stabilize their budgets with this? Can they offset some of that by moving other funds into cleaning up what if there's anything that's out there to further catch up and make themselves whole? Local governments over the last year used almost half of their CARES Act funds to provide aid to businesses and residents. There might be many who are whole right now and can utilize this funds for economic support. I hope that together we can, local governments working together can access either state or federal competitive grants, whether that's EDA, FEMA, Health and Human Services, or USDA grants. It's so challenging in a very crowded environment, competing with one another for a firefighter grant or economic assistance. But if we can work together, if that's allowable on the one hand and doable on the other, I know AML is interested in supporting local governments in that effort. I hope that together we'll work on developing shovel-ready infrastructure projects that will work with one another on water, sewer, and broadband improvements. That will continue to work with DHSS and Unified Command to make sure that we can do public health measures to support an economic rebound. We've got hopefully a busy tourist season coming up, and that'll mean that we continue to need to focus on testing and vaccine. And finally, I hope we can partner with the state on things like LIHEAP and rental assistance and childcare stabilization. Maybe just a final note on this front. The funds for local governments aren't a windfall. For 34 communities, it means less than $25,000 each of the next 2 years. For just under 80 communities, this is less than their community assistance payments. And those are things that keep the lights on right now and have for many years. Many were impacted within their budgets with reductions of revenue. So these are minimal amounts that continue to keep the lights on, but may not enable most local governments to kind of jump ahead as much as we'd like to. There are larger boroughs that'll benefit from the relief, but again, it's going to depend on what's gone into their response to the pandemic and how situated they are to get funds out to others. And it's up to them to determine kind of where they need to meet their needs and the needs of their communities. And the way we would suggest doing that for any of the communities or the state looking at these funds coming in is to look at your lost revenue plus your extra expenses during this public health and economic crisis, and then see where CARES Act helped and whether the American Rescue Plan allocation is sufficient. And if you've got more revenues and lost revenues and expenses than you had in federal relief or state relief, then probably you're still experiencing a shortfall that's going to be challenging. Let AML know about that so we can communicate that both to the state and federal governments. But we imagine that there will be a large portion of local governments who are in that boat where this doesn't get them to where they really hope to be on the other side of this crisis. And we know there's very specifically some communities, both cities and boroughs, who for that calculation, it doesn't work in their favor, that this federal relief package, because they're small populations or because they had just such significant losses in terms of lost revenue, this will not make them whole. We'll do our best at AML to help along the way. So we've been communicating with the Treasury to make sure the allocation is appropriate, that all the communities in Alaska are on the list that should be, to help with figuring out what this public lands allocation should be. We want to better understand what that calculation looks like between lost revenue and relief, and for those who it doesn't make whole, who you are, which communities those are. We want to support our members and anybody in understanding the guidelines that will come from Treasury or other agencies. I know with CARES Act, we work closely with OMB and DCRA on community reporting. We hope to be able to continue to do that to assist our members and others with reporting and compliance. Throughout, we want to be able to tell the story of Alaska's local governments, whether they continue to face shortfalls or challenges, or whether they're really successful in improving their own condition and that of their community. Let's share success and challenges so that we can demonstrate just what impact this relief has had. AML can play a convening role in developing partnerships with schools, tribes, and the state. We can coordinate joint grant applications where it makes sense. We can communicate with state and federal partners where there are barriers to access for these relief funds. We've got the Alaska Conference of Mayors, who as a priority this year has focused on economic recovery. And I hope we can tackle some of those real issues, not just in response to the pandemic, but that are always here in Alaska. Things like childcare, housing. Let's tackle some of these really big challenges that Alaska has, work together and see if we can utilize this relief and just the power of cooperation to move things forward. Finally, on the same front, let's make sure we're working with our nonprofits, with our business community, with the university, to know what the issues are that need to be addressed, to see how we can make small change, and support Alaska's not just rebound but overall resilience. With that, there's a number of resources out there. We'll make sure these slides, these links are on our website and get updated regularly. We'll have an American Rescue Plan portion of our website available, not just for this video, but for future videos or webinars that we do, discussions with members, and just as resources come in from each agency, from Treasury, from the state, we'll make sure those are available. And as members, as local governments develop their own resources and templates, we'll share those with each other. With that, thank you so much for your attention, and I hope this has been helpful. I know we've got work to do, but it's so great to see this relief come now, and we can only look forward to collaborating with the state to make sure, and others to make sure that this works as well as it can in Alaska's interest, in the public interest. So thank you, and stay tuned for updated information as we get it.